Achilles didn't look at the world in the same way as Socrates, and Socrates differed from Aristotle, and Aristotle differed from the Stoic philosophers because, like other peoples, the ancient Greeks were a bundle of contradictions.
Time to take a step back and see if we can understand the ancient Greek culture, a task both extremely ambitious as it is rewarding. What different political systems did they test, and which ones worked? How did their mythology influence their culture and affect their attitudes towards women? And why were they so competitive? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. If you aren't already subscribed, please go to classicalwisdom.com to check out our free newsletter and bring the classics into your inbox. This Classical Wisdom Speaks episode is with Jennifer T. Roberts, professor of classics and history at the City College of New York and the City University of New York Graduate Center. Her many books include The Plague of War, Athens, Sparta, and the Struggle for Ancient Greece, Herodotus, A Very Short Introduction, Athens on Trial, The Anti-Democratic Tradition in Western Thought, as well as her most recent, Out of One Many, Ancient Greek Ways of Thought and Culture, of which we will speak about today. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I really want to talk about your new book, which is got a fantastic title. I really love it. Out of One Many. And it works on many levels, and it obviously immediately grabs your attention. So I think we should maybe begin with the title itself and with the quote with which you begin the book. Why Out of One Many?
Yeah, the title was a work in progress for a long time, but we finally settled on this. The philosopher Empedocles, who lived in Sicily in the 5th century BCE, at a time when there were many Greek settlements in Sicily, he was very interested in change and differentiation, and there are many fragments that survive from him, and we don't always know what the context was, but he wrote at one time, thus at one time they all learned to grow into one out of many, and then they all split apart and became many from one, and it grabbed us, and so we went with that title. So I chose the title in order to underline the fact that the ancient Greeks were not a monolithic bunch. Actually, the title of the prologue to the book is They Contain Multitudes. Achilles didn't look at the world in the same way as Socrates, and Socrates differed from Aristotle, and Aristotle differed from the Stoic philosophers because, like other peoples, the ancient Greeks were a bundle of contradictions. So Greeks were contradictory and complex. Now, the Spartan poet Tertius identified courage in war as the only valid measure of a man. He says, I would not take account of anyone just because he's athletic or rich or powerful or handsome, or indeed if he had all of those qualities, if he did not have a fighting spirit. But he says it's in warfare that you find excellence, which is the very finest thing in all the world. And the soldier who dies in battle brings his father and his other countrymen the greatest glory, bearing many wounds in front through his breastplate and through his sturdy shield. Well, those shields were designed to protect not only the wearer, but also the man to his left. And it was impressed on Greek soldiers that nothing was worse than throwing away your shield and running. But the outspoken mercenary soldier Archilochus from the Aegean island of Paros, he looked at things differently. He wrote, no doubt some Thracian guy has got my shield. More power to him. It's in perfect shape. But I was forced to leave the thing behind under a bush. Me, though, I got away. The hell with that old shield, since I can buy another one that's every bit as good. So that's a very different view of war. And then there was the most famous female poet of antiquity, Sappho, from the island of Lesbos off the coast of what's today Turkey. She called attention to the outsized role that war played in the Greeks' frame of reference when she wrote in one of her most famous poems, some say Of all the sights one could behold, the loveliest is cavalry. Some say, no, infantry. Still others say, a fleet. I see things differently. I say that she whom one loves best is the most beautiful. Then there was Pindar from Thebes, north of Athens. He made lots of money composing odes in honor of athletic victories. So it's no surprise that he decided that excellence in physical things, in sports, this was the greatest glory for a man. And if he couldn't win a victory in the games himself, maybe his son would win a victory. And then on the other hand, and I know we're really running out of hands here, but well, there were Greek monsters with 50 hands, so all right. The philosopher Xenophanes, he had a different perspective. He was from Colophon in Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. As you can see, the Greeks were really spread out across the world, from Sicily to Turkey, up to Ukraine, down to Egypt. And he said, if a man should win in some event at Olympia, his compatriots would make a colossal fuss over him, but he wouldn't deserve it as much as Xenophanes himself does. He says, better than the strength of man or horse is the kind of wisdom I have. He says it's not right to value strength more highly than wisdom, because no guy who wins prizes for his skill in boxing or running or wrestling does anything to improve the quality of his life in the community, not like the wise man, not like Xenophanes himself.
Yeah, it's astonishing just to see the pure breadth and depth of the ancient world and the Greeks, and in this case, and that you can have such a varied experience from the highest kings to the lowliest slaves, and throughout the time period. I mean, it's quite a long time period as well. So you had quite an ambitious project to try to encapsulate a bit of this sort of essence and history and culture. And that's really interesting because, as you point out, you're like, how do we measure the success of a society? And maybe one of which is how well it's been preserved throughout history, if people have been impacted by their sort of lasting legacy. Though I mean, I guess there's always a question, does democracy always stay a democracy? Does it eventually evolve into tyranny or to other different types of governments? Can any type of government stay static for a very long time, or will it constantly evolve and change as the society does?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Athenian democracy held up fine until it was conquered by an outside force. And, Plato certainly, who hated democracy, believed that it gave way to tyranny. And Greek political theorists were all anti-democratic. In fact, a fellow by the name of McClelland, who was a political theorist in England, said that political theory was invented to show why democracy didn't work. And the people who believed in democracy were out governing. And people like Plato and Aristotle were in their studies writing about how terrible democracy was. But in fact, it held up fine. And what's interesting is that in the 4th century, there were, I don't remember how many, but literally dozens of civil wars in other Greek states, not in Athens. Athens was absolutely stable. There were 2 episodes of oligarchy in Athens, one in 411, 410, when things were going very badly in the Peloponnesian War. But right away, they decided this is stupid, and they went right back to democracy. And then after they were defeated by Sparta, in a war which they very nearly won, it was a very close run thing. It might just as well have turned out that Athens won. They did not lose because they were a democracy. They just happened to lose. But the Spartans took over and they installed a horrible oligarchy. And it was so horrible that the king of Sparta helped the Athenian Democrats in overthrowing it. Athenian democracy was extremely stable. It did not turn into other forms of government. And I hope American democracy goes the same way and does not turn into something else.
Well, I like that you preempted the question about with what the result of the Peloponnesian War, that it was by chance and not by democracy as well. I think that was a good point to add in.
Well, you've come to a person who also wrote a book about the Peloponnesian War.
So
I have some strong opinions about that. Yeah, I mean, it could absolutely have gone either way. There was a lot of chance. There were 2 storms that played an enormous role, one towards the beginning, one towards the end. That couldn't have been foreseen. And if it hadn't happened, things might have been completely different.
Oh, I always think it's so fascinating looking at those pivotal moments and just thinking, what elements of chance took place. Well, and as you so eloquently pointed out from the very beginning, I mean, it's not a monolith culture, both within regards to location and time and social status. So, you might have an ideal of the life of a woman in classical Athens, and maybe we know more about that than we know about how they were treated rurally versus a different social stratas. Like the information is often sort of depicted to this one sort of specific time and place. And
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask with regards to sort of myth too, because again, the role of women is, like we were saying before, it's nothing is static, in history. And I sometimes wonder that if how different, say, Bronze Age or Iron Age earlier myths were from the classical period. And I think again to the story of Demeter, who is extremely powerful and stands up to the king of gods. But even as you were saying, like Medusa, in a very much earlier versions, she's sometimes just a floating head. Like they almost had to invent a story for her to get decapitated. So it's just interesting to. I wonder. I wanted to ask you what you felt about with regards to the myth. Are sometimes earlier myths women more empowered than later myths?
Well, you ask a very good question because we don't always know when myths developed. We have no writing that survives except the Homeric poems and some of the Linear B tablets from the Bronze Age until pretty late in Greek history. I mean, before 700, and it's possible that the Homeric poems date from after 700, but Homer and Hesiod were around, say, 700. And so if a myth is in Homer or Hesiod, we know that it was early. But there are other myths, we don't know when they got started. For example, there are some early references to this myth of what we call autochthony, birth from the soil, of the Athenians. The Athenians believed sometimes, I mean, it's a funny word, autochthon, it means same earth. Does it mean that the Athenians always lived in the same land and they weren't immigrants from the north like the Spartans? Or does it mean that they literally grew out of the earth? And this myth was around early. There are early representations, but it was when the Athenians established their empire in the 5th century, and when the empire began to be oppressive around the middle of the 5th century, that people started talking about this in Athens a lot. And many of the myths that have come down to us, we don't know when they got started because of the absence of writing. We know some things because of artistic representation, but still, nearly all our evidence is from a comparatively late period. So we don't know. For example, presumably Hera was a chief god in Greece before the people we call today the Greeks invaded from the north. But in Greek myth, she's simply the wife of Zeus. And people assume that the reason she's so grumpy is the gross infidelity of her husband. But I suspect Hera was pretty cheesed off by being dethroned from being the chief divinity. But we don't have those early myths. So as you say, with Medusa, stories quite possibly had to be invented. So our written sources are so late that it's hard to tell what is an early myth and what is a later myth, because all myths were ascribed to the earliest centuries of Greek civilization, regardless of when they were made up.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. We had an article that went out not that long ago about Hera, and just how many temples that were dedicated to Hera that were much earlier temples, and with the Doric columns, and it was like the earliest temples were to Hera, not to a lot of the later Olympians. So it's, as you say, like she was dethroned. She was so much more powerful in an era that we don't really have much information about, which is, of course, an interesting insight in of itself. But I want to ask another question, a different angle for a bit, with regards to kind of the culture of the Greeks. And this was something you mentioned in the books. And I was like, oh, I guess I hadn't realized that. But why were the ancient Greeks so competitive? And I thought that kind of concept of their ability to have competition, it was like, oh yeah, I guess, there's that. That's very fundamental in so many of the myths, to go back to the myths, but also in the society. So how do you think that kind of competitive nature came about? Like, what made them be motivated to be competitive, and what were the kind of consequences of this attribute?
Yeah, I feel much more comfortable talking about the consequences than the origin. I mean, a lot of people will like to talk about geography and about how the mountainous nature of the Greek mainland stood in the way of the Greeks uniting into a single country, led to small city-states that fought with one another. But it's not clear to me how it came about, but it was there, as you say, in everything was a competition. Obviously, athletics was a competition, and they were very into athletics, but also, and war was a competition. But the tragedies that we read were presented at the festival of Dionysus in competition with each other. It was a competition, there were prizes, and in court, a court case was an agon, it was a contest, it was a competition. And this is how Greeks organized so much of their mental life and of their society. Their disposition was beautifully captured by the early poet Hesiod, whom I mentioned before in connection with Pandora, probably a contemporary of Homer. And he wrote two, his name is associated, who knows, but his name is associated with two epics. And the one called The Works and Days is, the opening delineates two kinds of strife. One, he says, is cruel, and it foments horrible wars and battles, and it's loved by nobody on earth. The other is much more productive, and he says it's kinder to men. He says men, andrasi, which means male people, not all mortals. And in fact, we have no idea whether Greek women were as competitive as Greek men. But Hesiod wrote about strife. Even the lazy man she prompts to toil, seeing his wealthy neighbor plow and plant, putting his house in order. Neighbor will vie with neighbor as they both quest after abundance. He says, this strife is healthy for mortals, as potter vies with potter, envious and begrudging, and carpenter with carpenter. Beggar is jealous of beggar, and minstrel of minstrel. He sees competitive as deeply ingrained in the Greek character, and he's absolutely right. According to Homer, Achilles' father sent him off to Troy with the charge always to be the best and preeminent over the others. The bitter, begrudging jealousy at work in the more dangerous variety of rivalry would manifest itself generations later in the democratic Athenians' habit of impeaching and exiling so many of their more prominent leaders, and in their practice of ostracism, which sent men who seemed too big for their britches off into exile for 10 years. The Spartans also deposed and exiled their kings with astonishing frequency. Anyone who rose too far above his peers, even by free election, risks becoming the object of envy and resentment. And the same combative temperament that had once manifested itself on the battlefield and would do so again, also drove feverish litigation in courtrooms. There's a character in a comedy of Aristophanes who has Athens pointed out to him on a map. He says, that's impossible. I don't see any juries in session. Athenians were so litigious, and the same rivalrous temperament, of course, contributed to the horrific frequency of the deadly corrosive wars among the Greek states, like the 27-year Peloponnesian War that killed about maybe 100,000 people in a world in which a state was lucky if it had as many as a few thousand. So this was a devastating event, and the sieges and the malnutrition contributed to lower fertility among women, and it was just a disaster because of this rivalrousness between the Greeks, and it was the way they were.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'm trying to compare to other cultures. I imagine so many are competitive, but I guess there might be other cultures that prize cooperation and contrast to competition. But I wonder if it's part in because of all the different city states that you kind of have these different areas aligned and yet competing under a sort of similar identity.
The smallness of it helped contribute to the constant competition. But you might think, oh, well, they were small. They had to make sure that they cooperated with each other to defend themselves against others. So, I don't have an answer.
Now we're kind of coming to the end of our time available. So I wanted to ask sort of one last question. And I think it's kind of a good overall question with regards to your book, because a large part of it is just taking a step back and looking at sort of the full picture of the Greeks. So what are some of the kind of important takeaways by having that sort of perspective? And what are some of the kind of common values that did unite the Greeks across the sort of the time periods and the places?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. The biographer Plutarch, who was writing under the Roman Empire, collected some patriotic sayings of Spartan women that were probably genuine. And we've seen what Sappho thought about the importance of love. But ultimately, very few words from any Greek woman survive. We have not a single word from any Athenian woman. So we don't really know what the women's values were, but among men, there were a lot of common values. We've talked about the competitiveness. Greeks also had enormous love of beauty. Their love of proportion manifested itself in the design of their temples and other public buildings. They cherished the beautiful human body, particularly the beautiful young male body. Although we see some change over time. In the 4th century, we begin to see depictions of the female nude, and although it has to be a goddess. And in later centuries, we even see images of people of both sexes who were neither beautiful nor young. But the Greek sense of proportion was also manifest in other areas of life. The saying, Meden agan, nothing in excess, was inscribed in Apollo's temple at Delphi. And we see this principle at work in the Greeks' horror at the way the Persian king Xerxes violated the natural proportions of the world by trying to make Europe and Asia into one country. One was supposed to act in a proper ratio to one's station. Humans were not to act like gods, because that would be hubris. Hospitality was very important across the Greek world, particularly if you wanted to cross the Greek world, because in the absence of credit cards and traveler's checks, it was tremendously important to have connections with peoples in other Greek states, hence the value placed on the relationship between host and guest. One of the ways the Cyclops Polyphemus shows how uncivilized he is in the Odyssey is that instead of offering Odysseus and his crew a meal when they arrive at his cave, he makes a meal of them, wolfing down one sailor after another. This is no way for a host to behave. And meanwhile, at home in Ithaca, of course, the suitors are showing their boorishness by taking terrible advantage of Penelope's hospitality, eating her out of house and home. One of Zeus's epithets was Zeus Xenios, Zeus, god of guest and host. I found out yesterday that there's a chain of hotels in Greece called Xenios Zeus, hospitable Zeus, I think is marvelous. In all times and places, Greeks had a love-hate relationship with the sea. It provided connection to other people. It offered the prospect of wealth gained through trade. But in the absence of navigational instruments, it posed a threat not only of death, but of lying unburied at the bottom of the ocean. All Greeks valued arete, excellence, but its definition changed a little over time. Originally, it was associated with elite men and their martial valor. For Plato, it becomes a unisex value of devotion to justice, but Plato didn't speak for his contemporaries. And the Greek association of war with manhood continued to contribute to an enormous amount of killing. But most of all, the Greeks were curious. They were questioners, and they asked question after question, and many of the same questions that people ask today. How did the universe come into being? Why do people act the way they do? Do we have free will? Are we completely responsible for our actions? If not, who is? Is there a god or gods? And if there is, what might a deity look like? Greek myth, tragedy, philosophy, historiography were just some of the forms in which the Greeks sought to answer these questions. And what they came up was diverse and fascinating, so much so that we still turn to them today for structures in which to explore our own questions. One thing that particularly interests me is the frequency with which modern playwrights have adapted Greek plays as vehicles to share their ideas. My colleague here at the City University in the theater department, Marvin Carlson, has edited a collection of Oedipus adaptations in 20th century Africa. And it doesn't even include Ola Rotimi's magnificent The Gods Are Not to Blame, which is set amidst the strife of 20th century Nigeria. A couple of years ago, I went to see Luis Alfaro's Mojada, which explores the plight of immigration in the context of reworking Euripides' Medea. And one of my former students, Cristina Perez Diaz, just published a dual language edition of Peruvian poet Jose Watanabe's Antigona. So, the Greek heritage is now in the 21st century undergoing not only re-examination, but real repurposing. The recent takes on antiquity are skeptical of any of the glorification of the misogynistic patriarchal slaveholding Greeks that used to be so common. The study of Greece isn't touted anymore as a return to the roots of that anomalous creature known as Western civilization, whatever that is. Feminist thinkers found Greece a wonderful laboratory for the study of the gender relations that are still problematic today. Hence Marilyn Katz's long article in 1973, 50 years ago, on Greek thinking about women called Early Greece, the Origins of the Western Attitude Towards Women. And later in her 1985 study of gender dynamics in Athens, Eva Kuhl's identified Athens as a kind of concave mirror in which we can see our own foibles and institutions magnified and distorted. Journalist Jess Zimmerman has undertaken to explore Greek mythology to get at the underpinnings of some of the disturbing ways in which many men think about women today and how women are taught to think of themselves in her book, Women and Other Monsters. So, Greece is very much alive, and I think in a way that prompts a great deal of extremely creative thinking, which is Greeks who were incredibly creative.
Well, I think that's very well said. It's one thing that we always say at Classical Wisdom is that when studying the ancient world, we're not taking everything that's said as a path of what you're supposed to do or what you're not supposed to do. It's about engaging in a great conversation. And as you say, asking the questions. And, sometimes progress is made when we reject the ideas, but often it's when we just engage with the questions in the first place that is kind of our task at hand, and to think about these ideas and the ideas that have come before us. So asking questions, I think, is absolutely fundamental to any conversation at any time to discuss all the great ideas, and many of which I've had the pleasure to cover with you today, from mythology and politics. I think we've covered quite a bit. So I want to say thank you so much, Jennifer, for taking the time to talk with me today, to kind of take a big look at the ancient Greek culture and way of being in life, and perspective, and to kind of try to understand this very interesting time period.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Anya. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.